Good afternoon. Yes, it is. How are we all? I'm Tim Sparks, Manager of Urban Water for the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation. Thanks so much for coming to our talk this afternoon. Apologies, you probably just saw me hastily walk through very, very late in the piece. We're moving office on the 9th of February is the actual date, and I've just been negotiating the seating plan for the floor and the branch, so I now feel qualified to work for the UN, or maybe negotiate the Brexit or something like that anyway. But
you're going to do as good a job as anyone.
Yeah, but there is a bit of a there is a bit of a segue between my journey this morning and today's speaker, in that it involved talking to engineers and non-engineers. So when I first sort of saw your spiel this morning, I thought, did I just read that? Engineers bill, talking to the community? No. I did read it, and so I'm really intrigued about today's topics. And obviously, with the Thames River and with the situation in London, because when I give talks on hydrology, one of the first slides I actually put up is that we actually get more rainfall here in Perth, albeit in 3 months, than London, which gets it over 11 or 12 months. But interestingly, when you start taking the populations into size, it is interesting, and our groundwater is a big bonus. So here's a talk today that's going to be talking about a real city on the world stage with real scales needed, but that there's a technique involving engineers looking at options with the community. So I'm really intrigued. So Sarah Bell is actually a professor of environmental engineering and the Institute of Environmental Design and Engineering at the Imperial College in London. Really? Is that as cool as it sounds? It sounds very good. She's a Chartered Engineer and Fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers and the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Managers. But you've got a Bachelor of Science and a Bachelor of Engineering from UWA?
Yes, I'm a UWA environmental.
And a PhD from Murdoch. That's right. This is going to be interesting, guys. I'm not going to say any more. Let's go.
Thanks for having me. The other piece of biography that I need to point out, because it's kind of a conflict of interest, is that my sister is Lisa Bell.
Right.
Yeah.
That wasn't in my notes.
No, but I think we just need to declare that. And so if you have any complaints about today's presentation, you can direct them towards the Corruption and Crime Commission, or her, if you like. So it's really good to be back in Perth. I am West Australian, grew up in Geraldton, studied in Perth, as you just heard. And through a few different career moves, have ended up in London, and I've been there since 2005, and now am Professor of Environmental Engineering. So today I'm going to talk to you about a couple of projects, one that we are just about to kick off in London, and one that we completed a couple of years ago, and hopefully you'll see that they build on each other. And so part of what so this is really kind of just a news story. There's not any kind of very dramatic technical insights in today's presentation, but I'm interested to kind of see if there may be any resonance with the kind of work that's going on here in Perth, and if there's kind of any insights to be learned from two what are actually very different cities. So the presentation, I'm just going to have a bit of a chat about what you all probably know more than I do about integrated water management and what that means in cities. And then the two projects I'm going to talk about are community water management for Liveable London and the Engineering Comes Home project, and then conclude with some thoughts about co-designing infrastructure and what it might mean to actually do engineering and water planning with communities. So we're all familiar with integrated water management. We've been hearing about it at least since the 1990s, but the ideas that underpin this way of thinking go back, further to the 1960s and even earlier. And we all know we're facing cities and water catchments are facing water shortages, droughts, floods, growing populations, still challenges in the developing world of actual basic provision. And there's been this move to a catchment-based approach of let's manage water as nature intended within natural catchment boundaries, a realisation of the importance of stakeholder participation in deciding about allocation of water resources and decisions about water infrastructure, that this should operate across scales from neighbourhood up to catchment scale, that it addresses water quality as well as water quantity issues, and learning from rather than culverting rivers and concreting over natural spaces, as was the trend at least until the 1990s, let's start to restore natural systems and learn from natural systems in how we manage water. And then, the idea is that this then brings lots of other benefits in terms of biodiversity, health and well-being, urban cooling, all of those kinds of things. It's a really great idea, but it's really hard to do. And it's really hard to do for many reasons. One is the governance and institutional structures that we work within, which, despite our best efforts, typically don't correspond to natural catchments. The other is that, we have over 150 years developed particular professional expertise in different disciplines, so planners and engineers don't necessarily see eye to eye or speak the same language all the time. And in terms of this idea of stakeholder participation, there's that experience that not all stakeholders are equal, and actually stakeholder participation can lead to particular powerful interests having particular control or influence above what might otherwise be deemed fair or equitable in a rational rule-based regulatory system. So amongst water professionals and government regulators and researchers, there's been this big effort to push for integrated urban water management, and there have been some advances, but it's consistently hard to achieve. So now, moving to London. So London is a city of about 8.8 million people. As we just heard, it has less rainfall than Perth on an annual average basis. It's about 600 mils a year, and it's forecast to continue growing in population. So Thames Water are doing their planning on the basis, so Thames Water are the local water utility, and they're planning for about 11 million people by 2041, and the forecasts are for potentially 15 million people by the end of the century. We are aware of, so the southeast of England is a water scarce region, partly because of that low rainfall, but also because of very high population. And climate change will have a mixed impact. We might end up with warmer, wetter winters, which would be good news from a resource perspective overall, but that's countered with hotter, drier summers, which might drive up demand, but also means that we're not getting that summer rainfall. And we're also forecast to get more intense storm events, which has implications for our surface water management and broader kind of flood management as well. So those warmer, wetter winters will increase fluvial flood risk, not just for London, but for most of England. And so, along with our population growth, and there is currently in London, it's not an exaggeration to say there is a housing crisis in London. There's a crisis of affordability, there's a crisis of housing quality, particularly for people on low incomes. And the Mayor of London has a target to build 65,000 homes a year, which translates to about 180 houses a day, or a new house every 8 minutes. Not currently achieving that, but that's a lot of houses. And if you're the water utility and you have to provide water, wastewater, drainage services to all of that new development, that's a pretty major infrastructural challenge. And on top of that, We've got the challenge of droughts. So for us, if we if we have 2 dry winters, so the Thames water supply region is a groundwater-based system, so it has some buffer, but it's a chalk aquifer, so it responds fairly quickly, and there's some buffer in terms of storage, but 2 dry winters put us into a fairly precarious position, and that's when we would tip into kind of drought management, a drought management situation. Also floods, as I've mentioned, and London has been there for a very long time, and it went through its last major expansion in the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century, and that's when a lot of our infrastructure was constructed, particularly in central London. Some of those water mains and sewers are more than 150 years old, and even in the outer suburban development, a lot of that kind of suburban development again happened in the early 20th century, the 1930s in particular, the last time there was a big boom in housing provision, and there's a legacy of a lack of maintenance and various problems with cross connections and leaky sewers and yes, sewers, stormwater drains actually discharging sewers into local rivers. So there are a lot of problems with managing infrastructure in an old city, and one that continues to be very dynamic, continues to be a place that people want to live and want to move to. And so that's the other element of how do you deal with water and water infrastructure in London, is that people do move to London because it's a very dynamic city. It does have a strong economy. There are lots of employment opportunities, there are lots of education opportunities, lots of cultural opportunities. So it's important to kind of maintain that focus on quality of life in London. And if growth in London is at the expense of just increased congestion, increased density, declining environmental quality, then we're not going to actually maintain London's position on the global stage. So the project that I'm part of, that's going to kick off in January, is called the Community Water Management for a Liveable London. Excuse me. And the acronym for that project, because you always need an acronym, is CAMELLIA. I wasn't involved in the decision about the acronym, so I'm not sure how you get CAMELLIA out of those words, but for winning research proposals, it's always good if your acronym is a flower or a woman's name. So the CAMELLIA project is a 5-year, £5 million research project, and it's led by Imperial College, and it was funded through our Natural Environment Research Council under a scheme that was all about translating science from their research base that they fund in universities and research organisations into impact. So we're not actually doing any new research in this project. It's all about, okay, we know lots of science about water in London. The other partners in the project, apart from us at UCL, are the British Geological Survey and Oxford, and BGS have really sophisticated integrated models of groundwater in the Thames catchment and for London in particular. So there's been a lot of investment in science and in engineering to understand how water and water infrastructure works. And so the Research Council has given us funding to try and get that into practice. And typically when academics and scientists try to do that, there is this conventional linear model of, well, we do the science and then we brief policymakers, or we make a model and then we hope that a government department picks it up and uses it as a decision support framework And this project is quite different. So we talked previously about the fragmented nature of governance around, in terms of water management in general. That's particularly a problem in London. And so, as we kind of said as we were preparing the research proposal, you know, there is no catchment God. There's no one in London who you can take your science to and say, here you go, please now make a rational decision. It's never been like that, never will be like that. So we devised a project that said, all right, let's just start with how London is. It's messy, it's complicated, but it is a great city to live in, and it's got these challenges of housing targets. So the vision for the project was to enable water security for a livable city through a systems approach which recognises all the interconnections between the different elements of water in the city, but that is based on this foundation of sound environmental science. So just to give you a bit of an idea of how water works in London, and don't pay too much attention to it, this is just to show you how complicated it is, but we do have Thames Water, who are our water utility. They're fully privatised. For a while, until recently, Macquarie Bank were a major stakeholder or major shareholder in Thames Water. They don't have a very good reputation in London as investors. But Thames Water is a fully privatised utility, and they own the water and wastewater infrastructure. They're regulated by the Environment Agency, who regulate abstractions and discharges, and also are involved in drought planning. So they do actually have a bit of a say on how Thames Water can use some of its assets under drought. Drinking Water Inspectorate maintains drinking water quality, and Ofwat is the economic regulator. Essentially, they decide how much these regulated monopolies can charge customers, but that's based on a really long and complex business planning process, which then goes back into cost benefits of investments and other things. Then there are the building regulations, and there's some provision within building regulations for water efficiency. Our building standards or certification scheme, BREEAM, also has some water efficiency measures in that. There's the DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, has produced a 25-year environment plan for the whole country. There are catchment partnerships that do provide some of this catchment management all across the country, including the Thames and other rivers in London. And we've got a government for all of London that is influential but doesn't have much actual power. So London has an elected mayor, Sadiq Khan, you probably know of him, and the Greater London Authority, which is the officers that implement London-wide policy. And the mayor produces a London plan, which has a time frame of 5 years. There's a sustainable drainage action plan, there's a green infrastructure plan, there's an infrastructure plan. There are all sorts of kind of plans and strategies that come out of the GLA. Do they have that much, the level of actual power that they have in planning decisions is quite limited, but they do have mayoral development areas, which are particular areas for urban regeneration that they do, that have special planning provisions. And then the mayor also looks after Transport for London, which is a major landholder and obviously a major stakeholder in keeping the city moving. And then we have 32 boroughs, which are local governments, and they're the kind of local planning authorities. They also typically correspond to lead local flood authorities, so they have some responsibility in flood planning. Some of them have started to produce integrated water plans as part of their planning framework, but that's a bit patchy. And then there's, developers, NGOs, communities, universities, everybody. So the picture is just generally that it's a bit of a mess. But, you might say it's a beautiful mess. It's, and kind of irrational, kind of hard to get your head around. But this is how things operate in, you know, what is a world-leading city. So we might, as scientists, complain that, you know, there should be one water authority, or we should have a clear and consistent integrated governance structure, or we can just say, this is London, what do we, you know, let's deal with it. And the other thing that we also have, particularly as water professionals, if you look at what Londoners are worried about, they're worried about a lot of things. Water is typically not one of them. And, you know, we might take a, well, we should educate the public so that they know how important water is, or we should charge them more for their water so that they pay attention. Or we can say, well, let's just start with what people do actually care about and try and see, can we integrate water into delivering those kinds of objectives and aspirations. So in terms of what do Londoners want, apart from remaining in the EU, Londoners, two things that Londoners want are homes and a nice green environment. So this is a photo from my local park. I'm very lucky that, you know, I have a nice kind of green space near me to go and lie under the trees. But that's the kind of thing that might be at risk if you just said all we care about is 65,000 new homes every year. Yeah, the other thing Londoners want is blue sky, by the way, which does sometimes happen, not just in architects' drawings. So the approach for CAMELLIA is really to say, you know, yes, we need to look at integration, but let's be realistic about, you know, how that's achieved. And so the project was pulled together by getting together, you know, Thames Water, the water company, various consultancies, importantly developers, because they're the ones who are delivering these 65,000 homes a year, governments and regulators, local authorities, various NGOs that are involved in environmental and water issues. But at the core of it, let's actually start with Londoners. Let's start with what they care about, green spaces and housing, and let that be our entry point for talking about water and bringing in the power of this environmental science that the British government has invested in over many decades. So I said the project is kicking off in January, but actually in preparation, the funding proposal itself took at least 2 years to put together to get all of these different stakeholders together. So the Imperial team led a proposal in a previous round of funding, and which was based more on the model of, we've got science and models of hydrology, let's get them into kind of planning and government. And that they weren't funded, so they went back and reapplied for the funding. And this time they twisted around, they got us on board and Oxford on board to say, actually we really need this community element to it. We really need to look at a different way. You know, our traditional kind of linear model of just transferring science into government hasn't worked, and B, wasn't funded. So the part of so a big chunk of the work actually, getting everybody together, was done as part of this proposal preparation. So the project has these overarching aims, but we're going to focus on 4 particular case studies. And the first one, which I'll hopefully be kicking off in the first half of next year, is a case study, a very small case study of urban greening with a social housing community in the London Borough of Southwark. Very urbanised, not a lot of green space. Residents there just want a garden space. So we're hopefully going to design a garden space for them, which will help them with fundraising to get it implemented. But we're also going to say, right, well, if you build a garden space, then that will have, first of all, you'll need some water to keep plants alive. But secondly, what surface water benefits does that have? And can we calculate those? And then can that be a new way of delivering what the community just sees as a garden, but what Thames Water will see as a piece of sustainable drainage infrastructure. The next is a major urban regeneration. So I don't know the figures for how many thousands of homes are going to be built under the Thames Mead regeneration, but that's led by Peabody, who are the biggest and one of the oldest social housing providers in London. So they're delivering this regeneration, which will deliver private homes as well as social housing. And the Berkeley are the developer who will deliver the private homes in partnership with Peabody. So that's a chance to look at, right, we're going to build a lot of new homes here. How can we integrate water management into both the landscape elements there, but then also into the actual buildings themselves and water efficiency. Then we have a case study of flood risk management. So this is based around water sensitive urban design, sustainable drainage measures with a local borough and a local NGO up there. And then the other major, the case study that Thames Water are most interested in is their Mogden catchment. So that area of London is the catchment for one very overcapacity wastewater treatment works. And so there are targets to put more people into that part of London, as there are everywhere, and there is no room for any of their sewage to go to. That is also an area where they have problems with cross connections and pollution of local waterways as a result of, at some levels, bad plumbing, at other levels degrading sewers. And they are, they're very keen, and they realise as a water company that they can't do that alone. There is no simple technical solution to that. They are going to have to work with people who live there, and particularly they're working with people who care about rivers in that part of London. And then we've got the various London stakeholders and also various government agencies and others. So I'll just quickly skim through these around case studies. And the idea of the project is that we will, through these case studies and other things that develop over the next 5 years, actually start to produce some tools that take the science from the BGS and Imperial College and put it into tools and methods that communities and local governments can start to use to make decisions. And so that might be models that you can sit around with a community and look at different options. It might be, and so there are various kinds of technical development that needs to go on to go from a very vast integrated groundwater model and surface water models and sewer network models and so forth into something that is usable at a very grassroots level, and then also at consultancy and government level. So just to mention the case study that I'm talking about, or that I'm leading on quite early in the project, as I mentioned, so you can see this area, this is the actual roof garden area. This is it's a social housing estate. Yeah, you can see there's a kind of high-rise tower block on one side. There are actually tower blocks on 3 sides of this space, and below that are some garages, so this is like a roof space. When the estate was originally designed in the 1960s and 70s, that was designed as this nice communal open space, but it hasn't been maintained, and it's now just this kind of dead, blank concrete space, and people kind of look out onto it from their flats, and they have ambitions of putting a garden there, so it's a nice place for their kids to play. They can grow some vegetables, whatever people want to do in gardens. And so we're going to work with them, as I said, to look at how do they supply the water to that garden, but then can we work with them to design that garden in a way that maximises its surface water benefits, so that it might become a sustainable drainage feature or a water sensitive urban design feature, And then that reduces, so at the moment in this part of London it's a combined sewer system, so surface water and wastewater both go into the same pipes, and it's highly congested, and at the moment that wastewater during a storm event overflows into the Thames. So there are considerable benefits to the water utility if we can stop surface water getting into the drains, and then that might mean that there's some financial or economic benefit to them that then might free up resources to be able to give these tenants on this estate, you know, a nice garden to spend time in. So I'm now quickly going to talk about the method that we're planning to use there, this co-design that then brings in some of the engineering benefits, originates in a project that we finished a couple of years ago called Engineering Comes Home. So in the Engineering Comes Home project we were looking at specifically the water, energy, food nexus. So it wasn't deliberately a water project, but actually it did end up with rainwater harvesting as the technology that people wanted to pursue and wanted to implement. So it did end up having a predominantly water outcome, but we didn't start there. So, and the purpose of this project was to test out the idea of, is it possible to work with everyday people who have very little, if any, technical training? Can you involve them in what we think of as really complex questions about designing infrastructure to meet complex challenges like the water, energy, food nexus? So, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with water, energy, food nexus, this idea that we need water to grow food, we need water to cool power stations, we need energy to pump water, and so on. And with forecasts for climate change, population growth, increasing consumption globally, you know, that you start to get to some pretty critical problems looming on the horizon. Now typically, when the water, energy, food nexus is spoken about by policymakers and researchers, it's thought of as this big supply side problem. So we worry about desalination plants, we worry about hydroelectric schemes that won't have enough water to operate. What we tried to do in this project is said, well, where else does water, energy and food come together? And it comes together when you're cooking a potato in your kitchen. So we thought, well, let's just start there and look out to the infrastructure systems rather than the typical view of the engineer, which is to start with the big systems and, you know, the end point is people's homes. And so we thought also, well, let's start with what is people's experience of dealing with water, energy and food, and do they have any ideas about, in their local neighbourhood, how things might be done differently. So we worked on the Meakin estate. So these people have the same landlord as the Kipling estate, which is where we'll be working with CAMELLIA, so they're neighbours. And it's 123 flats. It's a mixture of social housing tenants and private tenants and private owners. And I won't go through social housing policy that's led to that in London, but you know, enough to say that there's most people are social housing tenants, but not all of them. And this was the overall process that we followed. So we started, and because this is a research project, we could do, we had a lot of resources that typically wouldn't be available in a kind of commercial or policy kind of process. But it was important to just test out the ideas to see if this was viable. And people come from all over the world. There are all sorts of households and family structures. As I said, it does make a difference if you're a private tenant or a social tenant or you own your own home. It makes a difference if you've retired and your kids have left, or you've got little kids, or so there's lots of different things that are going on in terms of how people use these resources. There is no average standard kind of consumer. So that gave us some background as to what's already going on, and then also what ideas people had for how things might be different. We then took it into a series of workshops, and in between the workshops we developed kind of technical tools to be able to support the community in making informed decisions about options. So the first workshop was aimed to get people's kind of values. What is it that they valued about their local environment? What kinds of aspirations did they have? And then, you can't see it in this photo, I don't have time, I was going to show you a short video, but we had some design tokens that allowed people to tell stories about water, energy and food in ways that emphasised the connection. So it was a useful way to develop systems thinking in people who aren't engineers, and actually quite a lot of engineers are not very good systems thinkers. So to actually start to think about the connections between these different resources and then what they mean, where do they come from, where else, what other options might be available. So that gave us some ideas of technologies that people were interested in. It also gave us a sense of what they valued and what might be possible. So in between the workshop we then had a long list of technologies that we thought might meet those needs. We shortlisted those according to feasibility and desirability, and we came up with these 5 technologies or options to take into the second workshop. A wormery is like a worm farm. And we developed fact sheets because, for a lot of people they'd never heard of a worm farm or a wormery. So we developed some fact sheets to tell people what they were. And then, importantly, we had this life cycle assessment calculator. So this takes all of for the different options that we'd shortlisted, we then came up with some life cycle data. So then people could sit in the workshop and talk about, well, what if we had a wormery, and what if we had 50 flats were putting their food into the wormery? What environmental benefits would that have? How much food could we grow from the compost from that wormery? And then how much waste would we stop going to landfill? So they could kind of play around and then, well, what if we had all of the flats? What if everybody's food went into the wormery? Oh, what impact would that have? So people could play around with time scales, they could play around with scales of numbers of flats involved, and they could play around with different scenarios and options that we developed. And all of that was based on proper life cycle assessment data, so that there was that kind of scientific and engineering rigour behind it. So here you can see a couple of participants working with our research team to go through that process. So the calculator did it provided some engineering input into that conversation. But the other conversations going around the table were, of course, about, what if someone stole the wormery, or what if the wormery started to smell, or other things that people were concerned about. What if no one maintains the wormery? Won't that be too expensive? So other kinds of feasibility conversations also happened around the kind of technical calculation. So it wasn't that the technical calculation was the only thing, but it formed part of a conversation. And then out of that, this technology that was chosen after the second workshop was rainwater harvesting. And again, people in this community really had no idea about rainwater harvesting before we started to talk to them about it. So before we then went into more detailed design with them about rainwater harvesting, we wanted to give them a demonstration unit. And in a twist of good luck, my colleague Pete Melville-Shreve, who's based in Exeter, runs a small startup firm which has really Internet of Things enabled rainwater harvesting. So the purpose of his technology is that you can remotely control rainwater tanks, and then you have the possibility of utilising them much more for surface water management than if you just have kind of rainwater tanks at various levels depending on how much water people are using. So this is the idea that if Pete sits with his dashboard in Exeter and can see rainwater tanks in London, and there's a forecast for a very big storm event tomorrow coming, he can empty all of those tanks so that that storage is available when you need it during the storm event. So this is it's kind of early startup days for him, so he had some innovation funding to put some demonstration units into London, and he phoned me up and said, "Oh, do you know anywhere I can put my rainwater tank?" And I said, yes I do. So we put it on the Meakin estate, and so that unit then actually did provide water that people could use to water their little community garden that had been funded through the local council a couple of years earlier. And then we went into the third design workshop, and similarly to the life cycle assessment calculator, so very similar kind of design, but this time we had a rainwater harvesting calculator so that people could then calculate, well, how many tanks will we need, how big should the tanks be, and if we do that, how much water does that give us to put in our garden, and also what benefit does that have in terms of reducing sewer overflows into the Thames. And we went on a walkabout, so again, most people go about their daily lives and never look on the outside of their buildings to see these pipes coming down the outside. So we walked around and said, oh, well, that pipe there, that looks like we could put a rainwater, that's just coming straight from the roof, so that's an external downpipe, we could put a rainwater tank there. This one here looks like it's also got some bathroom waste in it, so no, we can't put a rainwater harvesting tank there. So we kind of walked around with people, and so probably for the first time people were actually looking at the water infrastructure that surrounds them. And we then said, all right, so how much footprint have we got at the bottom there, how big a tank we put there, and if we put a tank there, would there be any uses nearby? We're only talking about outdoor use at the moment. And they said, well, it would be really good to have one in the car park because then we can wash our cars. So we kind of did this, and sat down with the calculator and various worksheets to come up with, an outline rainwater harvesting strategy for that estate. So in terms of the evaluation of the process, people had a lovely time, as you might expect. We gave them food and we did actually give them some money, so that was even better. But their general experience was that they enjoyed themselves, they did learn stuff about water, energy and food, they learned stuff about water infrastructure, and people did talk about, it actually gave me, we certainly didn't enter into this as a community development exercise, but people said, it made me feel proud about my community and to see some of the possibilities here. It was helpful that they had a tangible outcome, like we didn't just use their time and ideas, we actually gave them a rainwater tank. And one of the things that limits participation is people have busy lives. So we had people coming, we had some people who participated all the way through the process, but otherwise we had people coming and going. And some people would have liked to have come more, but they couldn't because of work or kids or other life. So going back to our original purpose, which was to develop tools so that other people might be able to do that, we do have various kind of methods and tools in our kit, and you can have a look at that if you like on that website, which is where we've kind of gathered together the tools that we've got so far. And so the idea with the CAMELLIA project is that we might take a similar process, but instead of having a life cycle assessment calculator at the heart of it, we might have a surface water calculator, or we might have a water demand calculator, or something else that brings these science and engineering into the hands of community members. So some of these things that come out of our experience of designing, of doing co-design of water infrastructure is, and again this didn't start out as our primary objective, but we are discovering this is what we're talking about, what we're calling infrastructural literacy, that if you sit down with people and you talk them through this process, they learn stuff about how their infrastructure works. And this was just an anecdote, but something else about the Meakin estate is that nothing is metered. Maybe there are electricity meters, but they get hot water and heating unmetered, they get water unmetered. Now, Thames Water is undertaking a mass program to meter all of London. We didn't talk about water meters at all, but one of the participants who'd been through the whole process, and there are good reasons for social housing tenants not to want a water meter, and that is a conflict, particularly if you're a large household. You might actually, overall per capita, have very low consumption, but if you're on a low income and you're a large household, you might end up with a very big water bill that's unaffordable. So, talking about water meters with people on low incomes in London, particularly those with large households, is difficult. And we didn't talk about water meters at all, but one of our participants at the end said, oh, you know, the water company is talking about water metering. You know, I can now see why you might want to have a water meter. So these were things that start to kind of connect once people understand how their water infrastructure works. They start to see, be more responsive to some of these demand management kind of logics. But this process was a research project. It is very resource intensive. And so in future iterations, and we've done this, applied it to air quality in a different neighbourhood, but we're really trying to get it down to the bare bones so that you don't have a research team of 8 people to end up with a outline design of a rainwater harvesting system. That's not a very resource efficient method, but can we make it so that these co-design methods are achievable and are deliverable so that you get those outcomes without having to start from scratch every time. And we are interested in our kind of further application about this is, can you start with something like a garden or water urban greening projects and use this way of helping communities to slightly change what they do so that you can realise these broader co-benefits either to water, biodiversity, whatever it might be. And there is, though, this challenge not just about making it less resource intensive to do the process, but how can you replicate this across the city? It's not something that you would run at city scale, but it might be something that you try and see, how can we do this many times across London? So, yeah, I guess I'll just leave it there, but this is a couple of examples of how we're trying to do this work to engage communities in science and engineering through the design process, and in a way that brings the power, those powerful tools of engineering and science into the hands of local communities to start to achieve what they're after, rather than necessarily pushing our water sensitive agenda onto them. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Now, have you got time for some questions? You do? Yeah, good, good. Any questions?